Good. Good. Okay, welcome everyone. In today's class, we're gonna present on sustainable development, focusing on the sustainable development goals of the UN. To begin with this presentation, we're gonna start with an activity where we're gonna put some pictures and you're gonna have to say which type of development are we discussing in those pictures. What type of development is it? Okay, the first one. Economic. Is it? Okay, yeah, so it is economic development. Economic development focuses on the economic well-being of an individual as well as the quality of life. Some examples can be infrastructures or no poverty, etc. So we're gonna move on with the next picture. Which time? Okay, indeed, it is political. It is political development. Political development seeks the a more democratic state through elections and a free system, which ensures the rights of civilians as a whole. In the next picture. Social development, indeed. So social development focuses on ensuring the rights of the civilians by adapting policies and programs which make everyone feel fulfilled. Next picture. Yeah, environmental. So environmental development targets on using the natural resources that we have nowadays without depleting them and meeting future generations. So giving this activity, we can start the presentation of sustainable development. Right. We'd like to start the presentation with a quote by Kofi Annan, which was the 7th Secretary General of the UN. Our biggest challenge in this new century is to take an idea that seems abstract, sustainable development, and turn it into a reality for all the world's people. So sustainable development focuses on the idea of economic, social, political, environmental development, and tries to compensate and balance them out by developing as nations and trying to keeping it as a balance. To begin with, we're gonna talk about history of sustainable development in terms of international relations and the UN. So we can see how the sustainable development starts with some publishments of some books like Limits to Growth and some documentaries. These books and documentaries caught the attention of organizations such as the UN, and they started addressing this issue by creating kind of activisms and meeting with creating agreements on it. So we can see how it started on more of an environmental point of view of development with the Stockholm Conference, where it was first addressed environmentalism, and it said how economic and environmental practices collide and we're not enabling the cooperation and the existence of both. Following to that, we can see how the activism went outside of international agreements room, and it went to the streets with social movements that they did not only seek the protection of the environment, but also the protection of someone's right, of individual rights. And following this event, we can see the Rio Earth Summit, where the Agenda 21 was created. In the Rio Earth Summit, it was the first time that sustainable development was seen as a global priority. And they created 178 nations. They created the Agenda 21, where they focused mainly on the environmental aspect of development. And they decided that they were going to meet 20 years later to discuss and see how the progress and how they were standing, where they were standing. Following up to that event, we can see how the UN met again, and they created the Millennium Development Goals. This was in the 2000s, where 189 nation states of the UN met, and they decided and saw that the Agenda 21 goals were not focusing on sustainable development as a whole, and they were only primarily relying on the environmental aspect of it. So they decided to create eight goals which focused mainly on social development. However, there's one of them, the seventh one, which focuses on the protection of their environment. Following up, we can see the Rio 20 conference, which was the evaluation of those set of goals that were established in 1992, where they saw that these two ideas were colliding with each other, the idea of Agenda 21 and the idea of Millennium Development Goals. So they decided that these two types of development should be implemented together and create a new set of goals, which they did on 2015 when they created the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, which I'm gonna develop further in the next slide. Okay, so the SDGs, or Agenda 2030, are a set of 17 goals that all the 193 UN states adopted. This is something to highlight, as for example, the Agenda 21 was only adopted by 178, and the Millennium Development Goals were only focused on were only adopted by 189 states. These SDGs focus and target issues such as no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, etc. In addition to this, the SDGs have 169 targets redistributed between the 17 goals. For example, no poverty has 4 targets and 231 indicators that serve to see the evolution and to evaluate how the SDGs have been implemented in the country every year. In addition to this, this can be a perfect example in the UN of sustainable development, as they focus on the economic prosperity, the people, and the earth. And in addition to that, the UN added peace and prosperity. This is something to highlight, as they wanted a better world which could prosperate and live together in peace. Furthermore, and to finalize the part of the history and introduction of the SDGs, we can see how the SDGs focus on four principles. First of all is the integration, where the UN saw more complex and got a better idea of the system and thought about the interdependence and the connection between the goals, and thus they created more goals. In second of all, we can see the universalism, which I mentioned before. These are the first set of goals that are implemented by all nation states. So that is something to highlight. Furthermore, we can see how it is inclusive. Even though the 193 states have the responsibility to adopt these goals, these goals were created by the civilians and by different stakeholders of society, by the World Survey, where more than 5 million responses were taken, and they compiled 300 goals from civilians, from NGOs, from governance, etc. And after these discussions, they came up with this. And to finalize this, there's the characteristic of leave no one behind. For example, in the last set of goals, in the Millennium Development Goals, they were only focusing on more economically developed countries. We can see that in the example of China, where there was an exponential growth in the economy. However, they were not targeting those nations which were more vulnerable and were victims of hunger, of poverty, etc. So by this, the Sustainable Development Goals put in target and focused on those vulnerable nations, and decided that first we have to target these nations to later on evolve collectively.
Okay, so Jaime told us about the history and what the Sustainable Development Goals actually are. He gave us introduction. So now we are going to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals report of 2022. So first, let's start with what is the Sustainable Development Goals report. Basically, the Sustainable Development Goals report is a report where it's talking about the ongoing situations and the crisis happening in the world. So we can take everyday examples. that are ongoing or that have happened. For example, one of the things that was largely mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals or SDG Goals report of 2022 was the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all know that has largely influenced the whole world. So there we have seen in the report, it was mentioned the effects on it, such as we know that like 15 million people have lost their lives due to COVID-19. What has been also estimated is how the malfunctioning of the medical systems of vulnerable states has been shown and how they have poor management, and that's why they were suffering more than the other states. So in that report, it was also mentioned, like Jaime mentioned as well, leave no one behind, meaning that the less developed countries were suffering more than the more developed countries. The response that was that the more developed countries were giving to COVID-19 was better when it was compared to the less developed countries. So this report, so we have reports from SDGs throughout the years, and with these reports we can compare how people used to live, how situations used to be back in the days and how it is now. Currently, since the creation of the UN, the world is facing the biggest crisis. Approximately 2 billion people are living in conflicting areas, which is the biggest number since 1946. And that has been also shown in the SDG report. So the SDG report basically is showing how the countries are responding to crisis. Another important thing that was also mentioned in the SDG report, which again is something that the world is influenced by, is the war in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine has the potential to cut the economic growth by 0.9% in the year of 2022. It is also important to mention that not just the war in Ukraine, but also another factor that is fastening the crises that are happening in the world is the climate change, which again we all know are a factor that largely impacts the world. All around the world, we are facing floods, we are facing wildfires, etc. So we can say that if actions are not being taken right now, we can go to unreversible change, and that is why it's very important to follow this SDG goals, and that is why it's important for the countries to know how and when to react. So what is needed to be done? Can you go to the next slide? These are the issues that were mentioned in the SDG report, but what needs to be done is the countries need to make thorough changes in how they are functioning. So the thorough changes first need to start by the problems that are the first step towards ending unsustainable development and going towards a sustainable development. And that means ending the wars and the conflicts happening in the countries, and that can be developed by turning to peace and diplomacy. So when countries would follow some of these goals and would turn to diplomacy instead of wars, then we can take a step further and we can go to solving other problems. Another problem that is crucial to take in order to achieve these goals is to start being more eco-friendly and to get eco-developed. So the countries need to reduce their carbon emissions, and exploitation of natural resources needs to be stopped, meaning there should be drawn a line in how these natural resources are used. By creating greener jobs, the world in whole would improve and the countries would have better development. So another thing that was important and that was noticed during the COVID-19 pandemic is how countries need to improve in order for the countries to develop, they need to invest in data and information infrastructure, because that is one step that can be taken as a suggestion from the SDG report in order for the countries to get to development. So again, going back to how some more developed countries it's easier for some more developed countries to make more changes and to turn to follow these SDGs more, it's also important to mention that development cannot happen only in one country. It needs to happen globally. That means that less developed countries and developing countries need to be included in this change making as well. So even though, next slide. No, go back. Yes, okay. So as we can see here, these are some of the analysis done in the SDG report. So for more developed countries, for high-income countries, it's much easier to make changes and the changes to be evident. But those more developed countries should be aware that they should help less developed countries and developing countries into implementing changes in order for sustainable development and in order for these goals to be achievable. So we have discussed even previously in our classes that these goals are the purpose of these goals is and of this report is to inform the governments and people which steps they need to take in order to move to more sustainable development. But it's also important, this report also shows us at which state we are and at which state the world is in. So it's important for the governments to acknowledge that they need to make change and they should strive toward making changes. But also this, it's also commented that that these goals might seem unachievable or very utopian. But even if this is said, it's still valid. There are still valid goals and there are still a way of making sustainable development. So now we can talk about the pros and cons of SDGs. Yeah.
Okay, I think cons to be presented first, but so in the beginning, like Jaime mentioned, a quote from the UN General Secretary that we are dealing with a very abstract idea, sustainable development. Building upon that, since sustainable development is such an abstract idea, to be able to view pros in it is also kind of limited by that. But I will try to talk about a couple of ways how having SDGs in general is beneficial to the global community, but also how being associated with SDGs is beneficial to certain institutions or organizations that are associated to it. So first, like Ivana also mentioned, how it is much easier for more developed countries to be achieving their national outcomes. When MDGs ended in 2015 and SDGs were coming about, it was a prime focus that concerns that were very specific to less developed nations is also a part of the 17 SDGs. So there are, suppose, for example, SDG 1, poverty, SDG 4, quality education, SDG 5, gender inequality. All of these were kept in mind. So that slide. And also another benefit of SDGs is that just the fact that SDGs exist and they were drafted helps first the less developed nations to hold other nations accountable when they are not aligning themselves to the SDG goals. But also second, it helps less developed nations to save themselves when other nations are exploiting them or abusing their resources and keeping them from achieving their national outcomes as per the SDG goals. Next. Now I'm going to talk about how being associated to SDGs is also in a way beneficial. Why this is important is because it's a very abstract idea. And again, asking somebody to just achieve those goals without incentivizing them would not work out. So in many ways, organizations, actors, non-state actors are incentivized in a sense for them to abide to the sustainable development goals in their smaller communities. So I'm going to give the perspective of multinational companies for this presentation and see how as an MNC being associated to SDGs can be beneficial. Next. So first, SDGs are comprehensive global social contract for sustainable development, as SDGs help the managers of these multinational companies to align to basically focus their activities towards sustainability. And out of the 17 SDG goals, there are certain SDG goals that are very focused on helping MNCs and such organizations achieve that. For example, SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, SDG 12, which is responsible consumption and production, and SDG 17, which is partnership for goals. Slide. And building upon the same point as before, SDGs are a global categorization system of the grand challenges of our times that help managers of multinationals guide the sustainability action of their firms, which basically means is, like I mentioned before, in a way, aligning yourself with SDGs is a way to also personally help the organization. For example, an MNC cut down on certain costs in order to help climate change action. But if you look at it from another perspective, they also economically, a cut in their cost also help them to reduce their cost of production, eventually helping their economic development as well. So this has been able to get a lot of MNCs and non-state actors to abide to or align with the SDGs. So there are some figures how more than 70% of the world's largest companies claim to contribute to the SDGs. And the World Economic Forum has been tracking, measuring, and they've found that more than 8,500 companies, they've assessed more than 8,500 companies and rated their progress and alignment with specific SDGs. The question is change happening though, even if SDGs are.
Okay, wait, Charvi, can you? Yes. So we heard already a lot about like how the SDGs are doing good things and promoting development, sustainable development. I'm now going to talk about if it's actually promoting sustainable development and what are some problems with them. In 2015, when the SDGs were drafted, The Economist, the newspaper, called them worse than useless. So we're now going to look into if they're actually worse than useless. So first of all, the goals are not really goals, they're ambitions, because they're not legally binding. So countries are not, even though they say like, okay, they're committing to the SDGs, they don't need to follow them. And so it's important for the countries, if they actually want to follow them, to incorporate in their national laws, but most of the countries haven't done that. So it's really like up to them if they're following them and to what extent they're following them. Yeah, and that leads to an important factor that it's a lack of political will. And there it goes back to if they're actually sustainable, because you can see in countries that often don't prioritize their economic, they prioritize economic development over sustainable development and environmental factors, which can be seen, for example, in when Trump became president, how they just withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And so there was no sustainable aspect in following sustainable development goals anymore. And also furthermore, in COVID-19 also showed how countries prioritize at the end economic development over actual sustainable development. As then, on the one hand, you could also see like how state sovereignty became really important. It was not something like a global approach anymore, because they focused on the economic development, as a lot of people lost their jobs and unemployment rate got higher. And so it really needs incorporation of sustainable development goals into national laws, so countries actually follow them, because there's no way of states getting held accountable for it. The next one is that the SDG index does not reflect sustainable development. The SDG index is a global assessment of countries' progress towards achieving the sustainable development goals. And then every year in the reports are getting published where every country gets the index. And the top 10 countries on the SDG index are all Western European countries. And so you can see that there's like a correlation between being good at achieving those goals and being rich. And so, as on the other hand, most of those countries still face a lot of environmental issues. Like, for example, Sweden, they have the highest SDG index with 84.7%. But on the other hand, they have one of the highest material footprint. Material footprint is the consumption of products per person throughout the year, and they have 32 metric tons of material footprint, and that's equal to the one of the US. And the global average of your material footprint is 12 metric tons per year. So they're like way above the average, but still they're ranking the highest on the development SDG index. So you can see that there's a controversy about how much they're actually promoting sustainability by those goals. Yeah, that leads to the next criticism, that just 4 out of 17 goals focus on ecological sustainability. And those goals are goal 12, where they're talking about responsible consumption and production, and 13 about climate action, 14 about clean water, and I'm not entirely sure about 15, but it's the only 4 which talk about sustainability. And there it can be seen that development, like economic development, is ranked higher than sustainable development, actually, because they have a bigger influence on the SDG index. And I looked at the top 10 SDG index countries, and the biggest lack is always on climate action. They have like high scores, but then it's always like when it comes to the sustainable and ecological goals, they fall short there. So yeah, there you could also argue again about that's not actually about sustainability, those goals. And at the end, just promoting economic development, which then follows a Western idea of development again. So yeah. The ecological indicator are territorial metrics. With that is meant that countries, we're assessing those countries according to their kind of like their territorial location, but often they're committing the pollution somewhere else in the world. For example, Norway has a lot of oil plants in Argentina, which affects the economy there as well, and also the development, because it affects the tourism there and also the fishing industry. And oil plants in general are like not something good for the environment, but Norway ranked is 3rd or 4th in the SDG index because they're not doing those things in their own country. And so that means that the SDGs need to be universal also in their measurement. And so that sees that the measurement of SDGs are not really good and need to be improved to be actually like universal and equal for all countries. Yeah, and now I mentioned earlier that they're just ambitions, not goals. It's also getting shown by how they don't have an actual plan on how to achieve them. They're setting out those goals and then leave it to the countries how they're achieving them. And as I mentioned already, it's not binding. So all the countries are just committing to the goals without actually doing something. And the biggest problem is that they don't have a plan. For example, with funding and financing of those things. And SBC, a bank, recently estimated that Asia alone will need to spend $11 trillion on infrastructure over the next 15 years to achieve the SDGs, which shows that it again falls back to rich Western countries, which will be able to achieve those goals. There have been from G20 some attempts to help less developed countries. Like I know they're giving a lot of money to Bangladesh to achieve their zero carbon goal. But on the other hand, it's just like it's really selected countries which is funding. And also G20, it's also again rich Western countries. So about the inclusion about the SDGs can be argued a lot. Yeah, and so it shows also like how those Western countries, they're influencing who will be able to achieve those goals. Yeah, the next one is that they're wishful and unattainable. They're really idealistic. They're promoting a really idealistic world. which they try to achieve. But for example, to get rid of poverty in the whole world by 2030, I think at the moment, like 2 billion people live under poverty in the world. And so we have 8 years left. I'm pretty sure we won't achieve that, which also goes back to the fact that they don't actually have a plan how to achieve that. Another example of how it's not achievable is Bangladesh, because they want to become zero carbon emission by 2030 as well. Also, as I mentioned already, there's a problem of funding and actual action plan. Yeah. Just to conclude the whole criticism about SDGs, it's a huge problem because it goes back to power of countries, but also about sovereignty, because countries prioritize in the end their state sovereignty. Because the 17th goal of the SDGs is about global partnerships, and this goal often gets forgotten because then they're promoting their own country and making sure that they're getting economic development, because that's what the country which helps the country, or also infrastructure development. But in the end, those less developed countries and poorer countries, it's really hard for them to be able to hold up to the ideas of the SDGs, because they're also not getting help from the other countries who have the power to help them. So it's not a universal approach. And so to improve them, then it needs to be way more universal, and there need to be like concrete plans to achieve them.
So now we have this lovely paper 2 question, which is the fundamental weakness of development goals, such as SDGs, is their lack of focus on how targets are actually achieved. To what extent do you agree with this claim? So if you've been paying attention, all the answers for this question were in the slides and in what my fellow people here have said. So does anyone have any points on this to start a discussion? Yuvika?
To some extent, I agree, because like as Merle was talking about, most of the time what happens is